In June 1996, id Software released Quake, a first-person shooter which has a rather interesting development history. To get a glimpse of what Quake originally should have been, we have to go back in time, to 1990, when the name Quake was first mentioned while reading through a preview in the game Commander Keen.
As our follow-up to the Commander Keen trilogy, id Software is working on the Fight for Justice, a completely new approach to fantasy gaming. You start not as a weakling with no food, you start as Quake, the strongest, most dangerous person on the continent. You start off with a hammer of thunderbolts, a ring of regeneration, and a transdimensional artifact. Here the fun begins. You fight for justice, a secret organization devoted to vanquishing evil from the land. This is role-playing excitement. The Fight for Justice will be the finest PC game yet.
If you have played Quake, you're aware that the above portrayal doesn't reflect the final version of the game. The initial concepts went through several design iterations before ultimately settling on a shooter game that is closer to Doom than a superhero spin-off of the Marvel universe. Unlike Doom, Quake's 3D engine, today better known as id Tech 2 or the Quake engine, featured true 3D real-time rendering. The engine was later modified for the release of Quake 2. When the game was first released, the 3D engine supported software rendering only. However, in early 1997, a modified version called GL Quake was made available, which added support for 3D accelerators. And although this version of Quake does not support Voodoo cards natively, 3dfx released a glide wrapper called MiniGL that was able to translate OpenGL commands to the Glide API. Quake could now take full advantage of hardware-accelerated goodness of 3dfx's Voodoo power. In today's video, we will have a look at Quake using time period correct hardware and software. It's the year 1997 and DOS is making way for the new kid on the block. Windows 95, which had already been around for a year by now, has already received several improvements since its initial release in August 1995. I will be installing Windows 95B, also known as Windows 95 Service Release 2, which fully supports Intel Pentium MMX processors. Today's retro PC will be powered by a Pentium MMX with 200 MHz, paired with a Matrox Millennium 2, 48 MB of memory, and a Voodoo card with 4, 6, and 8 MB of video memory. There are two reasons why I picked this CPU. First, it was the fastest consumer CPU available in early 1997. And second, have a look how quickly the cards bounce in solitaire. As you might recall from my Tomb Raider video, I'm on a quest to look for games that can take advantage of the modded Voodoo card with 6 and 8 MB of video memory. Unfortunately, Tomb Raider did not benefit from the extra memory. But perhaps with Quake, we will be able to see that a Voodoo card with more than the standard 4 MB can improve the game's performance or its visuals. Since we are running Windows 95, I will be using WinQuake in version 1.09. This version supports software rendering only, and on the first start, we can admire the game in all its glory at a resolution of 320 by 200. Unlike Tomb Raider, Quake supports more than just two resolutions. With a higher resolution, the game looks pretty good, and you probably could argue that this Pentium is strong enough to render the game at an acceptable frame rate. To establish a baseline, I will run the Demo 1 benchmark in different resolutions using the software renderer. The game performs reasonably well at a resolution of 512 by 384. 25 years ago, 25 frames a second was all we really needed. Or at least to get as close as possible to the magic movie-like frame rate. I think this was largely influenced by the encoding standards used in television broadcasting at that time. In Europe, phase alternating line, or PAL for short, provided a frame rate of 25 pictures per second, while in America the dominant standard was NTSC, with almost 30 frames a second. Therefore, the occasional stutter in games would have been met with indifference in 1997, especially if you were not participating in a competitive tournament. So then let's jump into the results. At 512 by 384, the game is absolutely playable. I think this is how many will remember playing Quake. It is a good compromise between resolution and performance. The average frame rate at this resolution is 19 frames a second. At 640 by 480, Demo 1 finishes at 15.1 frames per second. And although the game does not run buttery smooth, I think it is fast enough to still be enjoyed by anyone lucky enough to have a Pentium 200 with MMX technology back in the day. But I believe many would have preferred the lower resolution to get those extra 4 frames. Things take a turn when we increase the resolution to 800 by 600. With a frame rate of 10.4, we can no longer make an argument for an acceptable gaming experience. Luckily, 3D accelerators just entered the market. And about 6 months after the initial release of Quake, its software released GL Quake, a version that can take full advantage of any graphics card that supports the OpenGL 3D API. With the release of MiniGL, a Voodoo from 3dfx was the only consumer-level card at that time capable of running GL Quake well. So let's pop in the Voodoo, initially with 4 MB, and see how a 3D accelerator transforms Quake. I think it is safe to say that similar to Tomb Raider, the Voodoo card makes a huge difference in visual quality and rendering speed of the game. Here is a side-by-side comparison of the software rendering on the left and the 3dfx version on the right. Both scenes are rendered in 512 by 384. Most Voodoo cards of the first generation were equipped with 4 MB of video memory, which allowed rendering Quake in two resolutions, 512 by 384 and 640 by 480. So let's see what kind of performance we get in the benchmark using the Voodoo card with 4 MB of memory. I tested each resolution 3 times and took the average of all 3 runs. At 512 by 384, Demo 1 finishes with an average frame rate of almost 55 frames a second. That is almost 3 times as fast as rendering the game in software. I think now we definitely have achieved smooth gameplay. Increasing the resolution to 640 by 480 does reduce the frame rate, but you may actually enjoy the extra pixels that deliver more details. At 36.6 frames per second, the Voodoo renders Quake more than twice as fast compared to the software renderer. And just in case you're curious what happens when I try to start GL Quake with a resolution of 800 by 600. Okay, let's move on and upgrade the Voodoo card to 6 MB. That is, we changed the texture memory by increasing the memory of the TMU chip from 2 to 4 MB. The frame buffer, for which the FBI chip is responsible, remains at 2 MB. Let's answer the question if the extra 2 MB of memory for textures make a difference in Quake. And no. The results are very similar within the margin of error of the 4 MB Voodoo card. Maybe with an updated texture pack the results would be different, but this will not be part of this video. We can see that the supported resolutions deliver the same results as the standard Voodoo card. 800 by 600 is still not supported by the 6 MB version where the extra 2 MB are added to the texture mapping unit. Better chances to get this resolution to work is to add extra memory to the frame buffer. Okay then, let's move on to the 8 MB version. And as you may have guessed, there are no significant changes in frame rates compared to the 4 and the 6 MB version. Same as Tomb Raider, Quake does not benefit from the additional memory on the Voodoo card. However, since we now have 4 MB for the frame buffer, we should be able to run Quake at a resolution of 800 by 600. Remember that whenever I have tried to run the game at 800 by 600 before, this error is all we got. Let's try this now with the 8 MB Voodoo card. Hey, no error message. The brightness is quite a bit darker compared to the other resolutions, but the game works. And we are indeed running the game at 800 by 600. The additional frame buffer memory actually makes a difference. Now we can run the final benchmarks for this video. Quake at 800 by 600 using the modded Voodoo with 8 MB of memory. With 21.8 frames per second, we are far from the results we have achieved in lower resolutions. But the game is still playable utilizing the Voodoo card. Here is a bit of gameplay with a resolution of 800 by 600. I increased the brightness while editing this video to see a few more details. If you remember the video where I created those memory mods and tested the card with 3D Mark 99, there was a benchmark that also behaved similarly in terms of the darker colors. The race benchmark was significantly darker at a resolution of 800 by 600 compared to 640 by 480. I also tried to run Quake at a resolution of 1024 by 768, but this did not work. We get the same error we have seen previously. So, what have we learned from this experiment? Quake does not benefit much from the extra memory on the Voodoo card. Even back in 1997, I think most people would have preferred lower resolutions and higher frame rates. But it is interesting to see that a 4MB frame buffer unlocks a higher resolution, and the game is still playable as you can see. Perhaps we need to evaluate games that were launched a few years later, say 2 years ahead, to see a difference in the extra memory. But by then the Voodoo chipset may be too weak to render games at an acceptable frame rate. We will see. There are many games that can be tested, and I am for sure not yet done with my quest to find games that benefit from more Voodoo memory. And this is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the content and don't forget to give this video a like. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in one of my other videos.